At the empty station, the bride waited alone until a stranger said her name. The station lay nearly empty beneath the pale afternoon sky. Its long wooden platform stretched thin between the tracks and the open prairie, as if it were waiting for something that had forgotten how to arrive. And at its far end, the bride stood alone, with one small trunk at her feet and dust clinging to the hem of her traveling dress. Her gloved hands folded tightly before her as she scanned every shifting shadow for the man who was supposed to meet her. The train that brought her in had already vanished down the line, its smoke long dissolved into the wide blue, leaving behind only the quiet creak of the station sign and the dry whisper of wind moving through scattered weeds along the rails. She had arrived with hope folded carefully into her chest, like a letter she had read too many times, believing the words that promised a home and a name spoken with belonging. Yet, as the minutes stretched into an hour, the platform answered her waiting with nothing but distance. A station clerk passed once and glanced at her with mild concern, then looked away as if she were no longer his matter. Once the train had gone, and a ranch hand drinking from a canteen slowed near the steps before moving on, his curiosity fading when no one else appeared to claim her. The bride shifted her weight and tightened her shawl against a chill that came not from the air, but from uncertainty, her eyes searching the empty road beyond the station where a rider should have emerged by now, knowing exactly where to find her. She told herself delays were common in wide country like this, that horses stumbled and trails bent longer than expected. Yet doubt pressed quietly at the edge of that faith. With every passing moment, she stood unclaimed in plain sight. The wedding ring she wore felt suddenly heavier on her finger, not with promise, but with the unanswered question of who, exactly, had asked her to wear it. As the sun lowered, casting longer shadows across the boards, the station grew quieter still, the last wagon rolling away down the road and leaving behind only her small figure against the wide open land. She lifted her chin when footsteps sounded at the far end of the platform, but the sound belonged only to another stranger passing through, not to the man whose letters had guided her across miles of distance and belief. The truth settled slowly and without ceremony, not as a blow, but as a cold recognition that she had not been delayed upon this platform, but abandoned upon it. And as the first weight of that understanding took hold, the wind carried her name softly from her own lips, as if she were testing whether it still belonged to her when no one else would claim it. He had slowed his horse at the edge of the tracks only to let a freight wagon pass, never intending to stop at the station at all. Yet, as he waited, he saw the figure standing alone at the far end of the platform, small against the wide boards and the widening sky. And something in the stillness of her posture caught his eye in a way motion never could. She did not pace as the anxious often do, nor did she sit to rest, but remained standing with her hands folded and her gaze fixed on the empty road, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. And the sight of that quiet waiting stirred a familiar unease in him. The memory of how abandonment often arrives, not with noise, but with absence. He watched from the shadow of his horse as the last of the passing traffic thinned and moved away, leaving her more exposed with each moment. And he began to recognize the weight that settled into her shoulders as hope gave way to the careful stillness of someone who does not yet wish to admit what she already knows. The station clerk locked the door to the small office and nodded at her once as he passed, offering neither question nor comfort. And when she did not turn to follow him, the certainty of her solitude deepened. The stranger felt the pull then, quiet but insistent, not of duty shaped by law, but of conscience shaped by sight. And he urged his horse forward, a few slow steps along the rail until the creak of leather drew her attention at last. She turned with a guarded start, her eyes lifting not in greeting but in instinctive caution. For the world had already taught her in this hour that promise could dissolve without warning. He lifted his hand slightly to show he meant no threat, and asked in an even voice if she was waiting for someone. And though she hesitated, the truth rose from her with a faint tremor as she answered that she had been waiting all afternoon for a man who had sent for her and had not come. The admission seemed to take strength from her once spoken, and she looked past him again toward the empty road as if still unwilling to let go of its answer. He followed her gaze and saw only dust settling where a rider might once have been expected, and in that space between expectation and emptiness, he felt the old line within him sharpen again, the one that marks where a man may continue on his way or step into what another has been left to face alone. When he spoke again, it was not to offer help yet, but simply to confirm what he already saw, that the station would soon close, and night would not ask her why she stood there, and she nodded slowly, as if accepting not his words, but the truth they named. And in that shared understanding, the first fragile connection formed between witness and waiting. The first hush of evening slipped across the tracks like a held breath, and with it came the realization that waiting had reached its end, whether the stranger arrived or not, and the man felt the moment draw a line he could no longer stand beside without crossing. He dismounted and stepped fully onto the platform, the solid sound of his boots on the boards startling the bride just enough to pull her from the distance she had been staring into. And when she looked at him again, there was no longer caution alone in her eyes, but the fragile edge of fear that comes when help might be needed, and no promise has yet been made. He told her the daylight would fail soon, and that no one should remain alone at the station after dark, not as a warning shaped by threat, but as a simple truth of the wide country beyond the rails. And when she lowered her gaze to the single trunk at her feet and said she had nowhere else to go, the words settled between them with quiet finality. The choice he made then did not rise with dramatic force, but with the steady weight of refusal to abandon what had already been abandoned once. And he took hold of the trunk's handle and said only that she would not be left on that platform through the night. She stiffened at first as though the offer itself startled her, and he released the trunk at once, telling her she need not decide anything she did not wish to. Yet even as he spoke, the last rim of sun dipped low enough to throw the station into shadow, and the wind rose across the open land with a colder voice than before. The bride hesitated only a moment more before nodding. Not in surrender, but in trust, tested by the simple reality that no other hand had reached for her at all. He lifted the trunk again and carried it toward his horse with deliberate care, placing it securely across the saddle before offering his arm for her to steady herself as she stepped down from the platform. And though she did not take it fully, she allowed her fingertips to rest lightly against his sleeve, the smallest measure of balance accepted. When she settled behind him on the horse, the world shifted subtly for both of them, the station slipping away behind as the prairie opened ahead, and with that single movement, the truth changed its shape from abandonment endured to rescue chosen. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet turning of one life away from empty boards and toward shelter still unknown. The ride from the station was slow and careful, not because the distance was great, but because the night had begun to settle fully over the land, and the bride sat stiff behind him at first as the last pale strip of the platform disappeared into shadow, her hands resting lightly against the saddle, as though she were still uncertain whether this movement away from the rails was real or only another promise that might dissolve. The prairie opened wide around them with the quiet breath of wind moving through the grass like water across a shore. and by the time the first lights of a small ranch house came into view, the tension in her shoulders had eased just enough to betray the exhaustion she had been holding upright since the afternoon. He guided the horse into the yard and dismounted first, tying the reins before lifting the trunk down and setting it near the porch, as if the simple act of placing it there might anchor her to something solid at last. The woman of the house opened the door at the sound of hooves and paused in surprise at the sight of the stranger with a bride in traveling clothes. Yet questions fell away when she saw the weariness in the young woman's face and the way her hands trembled with the last of the day's strain. Without ceremony, she stepped aside to let them in, the warmth of the interior rising to meet the cold as the door closed behind them, and the bride let out a breath she had not realized she was holding as the stove's steady glow touched her face. She was guided to a chair and offered water and bread, and though her appetite was thin, she ate enough to prove to herself that the world had not ended on the platform as she had feared. The man stayed standing at first, uncomfortable with rest while she was still gathering herself, but the woman motioned him to the table with a look that held no doubt about where he belonged in that moment. As the bride warmed, words returned to her in slow fragments, and she admitted in a quiet voice that the letters had promised a ranch, a home, and a man waiting with a name ready to be spoken as hers. And though she had traveled alone across miles with that promise folded into her heart, she had reached the end of the line with only the wind to greet her. The woman listened without judgment and said simply that a house does not always belong to the one who first names it, and the words, gentle as they were, settled into the bride with a steadiness that felt like the first real shelter she had known that day. When at last sleep claimed her in the small spare room, her travel dress folded neatly beside the bed and her trunk set within reach, the man remained awake near the stove a while longer, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that had made room for a stranger without asking for proof, and he understood that safe haven had not come in the shape he or the bride might have expected, but it had come all the same, firm and unspoken in the simple act of being allowed to stay. Morning came softly through the small ranch window, light settling across the quilt where the bride slept, as if the night itself had laid down its weight to rest beside her. And when she woke, the first sound she heard was not the whistle of wind across empty boards, but the quiet clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the low murmur of voices that did not belong to strangers anymore. She rose slowly, testing the room as one tests unfamiliar ground, and when she stepped into the warmth beyond the doorway, the woman greeted her with a gentle smile and placed a cup of coffee into her hands without asking her name, as if care itself needed no introduction. The man stood near the table with his hat in his hands rather than on his head, a small gesture that told more of his respect than words could manage. And when the bride met his eyes across the morning light, she felt the fragile edge of last night's fear begin to soften into something steadier. They spoke then, not all at once, but in small truths offered carefully, and she told them of the letters that had crossed long distances with promises sealed in careful handwriting, of the man who had written of open land and waiting arms, and of the way each word had felt like a bridge she could cross into a different life. The man listened without interruption, his gaze lowered, not in disinterest, but in consideration. And when she finished, he told her simply that many men write the future more easily than they live it. And though the words were plain, they carried neither bitterness nor judgment, only the shape of experience. She asked him at last why he had stopped at the station when no one else had, and the question held no accusation but honest wonder. And after a moment, he answered that he had once stood in a place where waiting had grown too loud to ignore, and when he saw her standing alone with the platform closing around her, he recognized the sound of that same silence. The woman watched them with quiet attention, as if measuring not only their words, but the spaces between them. And when she spoke, it was to say that trust grows not from great declarations, but from the steady presence of those who remain when leaving would be simpler. The bride felt that truth settle into her as the morning stretched on, and in the shared work of preparing the day's meal, in the simple passing of bread and water, she began to feel her body release the long grip it had held since the train pulled away without answers. By the time the sun climbed higher, the station felt farther away than distance alone could measure, and though the future remained uncertain, a bond had begun to form in the quiet space between those who had chosen not to turn away from one another when circumstances offered every excuse to do so. The sound of hooves reached the yard before the rider himself came into view, sharp and deliberate, against the packed earth, as if each step were meant to be heard, and the man at the table grew still at once, his gaze lifting toward the window with a knowing that settled uneasily into the quiet of the morning. The bride felt the shift without understanding it, a tightening in the room that marked the arrival of something unwelcome. And when the woman moved to the door, the visitor was already dismounting, his coat bearing the dust of hard travel and his expression shaped by purpose rather than chance. He asked without greeting if a bride had passed through the station the day before, and he spoke the question as one who expects answers to bend toward him. And the bride felt the blood drain from her face as recognition took hold of his voice, matching too closely the tone of the letters that had drawn her across miles of distance. The man stepped forward then and answered that a woman had indeed come by the station, and that she was now under the protection of this house. And the words, protection and house, seemed to strike the rider like a slight he had not anticipated, for his mouth tightened and his eyes slid past the man toward the doorway, as if to measure what he had assumed already belonged to him. He said that the bride had been summoned by promise, and that those promises carried claims of their own, spoken with a confidence that treated distance and consent as lesser matters. And the woman answered calmly from the porch that a promise broken dissolves its own authority, leaving nothing behind but the harm it has made room for. The rider laughed once without humor and said the law would not see it that way, that arrangements made in ink and sealed by expectation were not so easily set aside. And as he spoke, the shape of the threat came clear, not in raised weapon or shouted demand, but in the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to taking what the road delivered. The bride stepped forward at last, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, as she said that she had waited at the station until hope itself had thinned to nothing, and that no claim met her there but silence. And the rider's eyes hardened as he took in her words, the refusal striking him more sharply than he had expected. With a final look at the man who stood between them, he mounted again and rode away with the promise that the matter would not end in the yard where it had begun. And as the dust of his leaving settled, the house remained standing in the quiet that follows a warning clearly spoken, each of them knowing now that the shadow cast by broken promises had found its way to their door. The quiet that followed the rider's departure did not bring relief, but a deeper unease that settled into the corners of the house like a question left unanswered. And as the dust beyond the gate fell back into stillness, the bride stood near the doorway with her hands folded tight at her waist, as though holding herself in place against the tremor that would not yet leave her. The man closed the door gently and rested his palm against the wood for a moment, as if listening for pursuit through the grain, then turned to face her with a steadiness that did not pretend the danger had passed. And in his eyes she saw not fear, but the careful weight of someone measuring what must be risked to keep what has been given shelter. She spoke first, her voice low and shaken, as she asked if she had brought trouble to the house by coming there at all, and the question struck him with quiet force, because it carried the old shape of shame that follows those who have been promised safety and find only conflict instead. He answered her without hesitation that the trouble had come not from her arrival, but from the man who believed promises were chains rather than invitations, and that no roof worthy of being called a home ever casts out the one who seeks refuge under it. Still, doubt pressed in on her as she moved to the table and sat, the morning's warmth now distant as she traced the rim of an empty cup, and confessed that part of her feared she had traded one uncertainty for another, stepping from abandonment at the station into a future that would demand she stand against a man who would not easily release his claim. The woman listened with folded hands and said softly that standing against a false claim is not a debt owed to conflict, but a gift given to truth. Yet even as the words comforted, they did not erase the weight of the choice forming before the bride's heart. The man felt that weight settle into himself as well, for he knew the rider's warning carried with it the promise of law bent into pursuit, and the shelter he had given might soon be measured against statutes written far from the reach of conscience. As afternoon lengthened into slower light, the bride stepped outside alone for a time and walked the edge of the yard where the grass bent low in the breeze. And every step she took away from the porch seemed to test how firmly the ground would hold her if she were asked to leave again. When she returned, she told the man that she did not wish to be hidden or carried further from what had already found her. Yet neither could she bring herself to walk back into a claim that had formed itself in absence and now sought to rule her arrival. And in that confession, the conflict inside her rose to the rider returned before sunset with the law at his side, the sheriff's badge catching the last light of day as they entered the yard, with measured steps that carried the weight of authority without raising a voice. And the bride felt the moment tighten around her chest as she stood with the woman in the doorway while the man moved forward to meet what had come. The sheriff spoke calmly and said that a formal complaint had been filed, claiming breach of arrangement and unlawful harboring. And though his tone was even, the disturbance of order lay clear in the very fact of his presence. The man listened without interruption, and then answered that the only unlawful act he had witnessed was the abandonment of a woman at a public station after promises had been made great enough to move a life across distance, and that the house had offered shelter not for defiance, but for necessity, and in that necessity he would not retreat. The rider interjected with sharp insistence that arrangements written in agreement carried weight beyond sentiment, and the bride felt the pull of old fear rise as he spoke, as if the future she had refused still lay folded within his reach. Yet when she stepped forward into the open yard, her voice did not shake as she said that no agreement that ends in desertion can demand obedience afterward. The sheriff looked at her then directly and asked if she had been met at the station as promised, and when she answered no with steady clarity, the shape of the case altered visibly, the rider's confidence tightening into something closer to concern. Still, the rider pressed his claim, saying delay alone did not dissolve expectation, and the man felt the law's balance waver between what could be written and what had been lived. And in that narrowing space, he made his choice fully known by placing himself between the bride and the two men without raising his hands or his voice. He said that if consequence must fall for offering protection where it was needed, it would fall upon him alone, and that no woman would be compelled by absence to step into a future claimed by another's words alone. The woman standing behind him felt the weight of that sacrifice and placed her hand on his shoulder in quiet witness. And the bride herself stood not hidden, but fully visible in the open yard, choosing courage not as defiance, but as presence. The sheriff held the moment in silence longer than law usually allows, then said that truth spoken clearly must be weighed where it stands, and that the claim set before him carried too much shadow to move forward without deeper account. And with that, he turned his horse away first. The rider lingered only a breath longer, with resentment in his eyes, before following. And as the dust of their leaving settled once more across the yard, the bride felt the ground beneath her steady again, not because danger had vanished, but because it had been met without retreat. The yard grew quiet again after the sheriff and rider disappeared down the road, but it was not the uneasy quiet of waiting this time. Rather a deeper stillness shaped by what had finally been spoken aloud and answered without collapse. And the bride stood where she was for several moments, as if feeling the steadiness of the ground return beneath her feet, one slow breath at a time. The man remained near her side without touching her, a silent presence that did not press for gratitude or claim. And in that restraint, she felt the first true shape of safety settle into her chest since the day she stepped onto the empty platform. The woman closed the door gently behind them and motioned them back inside, not to hide what had happened, but to gather what it had changed. And as they returned to the table, the simple room seemed quietly altered, as if it now held not only shelter, but decision as well. The bride spoke then of the moment the station had fallen silent behind the departing train, and how she had known, even before doubt fully formed, that something wrong had already been chosen without her consent. And the man listened with a gravity that did not seek to repair the past, but to honor its truth, while the woman added that the law moves slowly, but conscience must often act first to keep the living from being crushed beneath delay. By evening, word of the confrontation had begun to move through the nearby homes and along the roads connecting them, not as rumor this time, but as something closer to understanding. And a neighbor arrived with bread and another with warm cloth. Small offerings laid at the door, not as spectacle, but as quiet acknowledgement of where the town's witness now rested. When the sheriff returned alone before night fully settled, he did not dismount in haste, but with the careful pace of a man carrying revised judgment, and he said that abandonment weighed heavily in the matter brought before him, and that no authority could compel a woman into a claim whose first expression had been absence. The bride felt the last tightening in her chest loosen at those words, not with triumph, but with release, and the rider's shadow receded from her future, not with noise, but with the quiet finality of law-choosing conscience as its guide. When the sheriff left again, it was with a nod, not only to the man who had stood firm, but to the woman who had stood visible in her own defense, and the family that had formed in hours of witness and risk felt itself drawn into a new alignment, not by blood or decree, but by truth shared without retreat. Justice had not thundered into the yard with force, but it had arrived all the same, steady and unadorned, binding together the abandoned, the witness, and the shelter into one clear line that could now be followed without fear of losing its way. In the days that followed the sheriff's quiet ruling, the ranch settled into a gentler rhythm that felt newly earned, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath through long uncertainty, and the bride moved through the small house no longer as a guest guarded by circumstance, but as a woman beginning to choose where her life would take root. She helped the woman with daily work, learning the small patterns of the place, the way the stove must be coaxed awake in the morning, the time the chickens wander back toward the coop at dusk, the habits of a land that does not hurry but never forgets its duties. And in those steady motions, she felt the fragile parts of herself knit together without being asked to explain how they had first unraveled. The man returned each evening from his work with the same quiet consistency that had first carried her from the empty station, never speaking more than was needed, yet always present in a way that asked nothing and withheld nothing in return. And in that simple constancy, she learned the difference between a promise written in ink and one lived in sunlight and dust. The town's gaze softened as well, not by grand declaration, but by small recognitions, a greeting offered without question, a pause that held respect rather than curiosity. And the past that had tried to define her by absence loosened its grip as the present continued to place her firmly among those who remained. One evening, as the sky stretched wide and pale over the prairie, the bride stood at the edge of the yard where the station lay far beyond sight and felt no pull toward it at all. Only a calm awareness that the road which had once carried her into waiting had now carried her into belonging without fanfare or debt. She did not speak vows, and no future was named aloud. Yet when she turned back toward the lighted house and the figures moving within it, her step carried the quiet confidence of someone who no longer stands at the edge of her own life, wondering if she will be claimed. The man met her at the door, not with a question, but with a shared understanding formed over days of courage and choosing. And in that shared ground, the promise she had crossed miles to find revealed itself at last in a form that asked not for surrender, but for presence. The empty station became only a memory of where waiting had ended and purpose had begun, and in its place grew a life shaped not by the stranger who had once spoken her name without meeting her there, but by those who had learned to speak it with their actions every day that followed. Sometimes the life we were promised must fall apart before the right one can begin. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey from waiting to belonging. May every empty place you face lead you gently toward purpose and home.